"Sir, we will need you to move to economy." The words weren't screamed, but they hit the first-class cabin with the force of a gunshot. A flight attendant stood over him, her smile a perfect plastic lie. Beside her, a woman in pearls stared at the black man in seat 1, her eyes cold with the certainty that this seat, her seat, had been stolen. Every head turned. Phones, hidden in laps, began to record. This was the moment they were all waiting for. But the man, Rico Anderson, didn't flinch. As a billion-dollar merger sat waiting on the screen of his tablet, he slowly looked up, his face a mask of absolute, chilling calm. The twist wasn't the racism, it was the silence that followed. A silence so heavy, so deliberate, it felt like the countdown to an explosion. Have you ever seen a man hold the power to ruin everyone in the room and choose to do nothing at all? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Rico Anderson wasn't just any passenger on Flight 217. At 62, he was the Rico Anderson, the legendary CEO of a Fortune 500 logistics firm. He was a titan, a kingmaker in a world of steel containers and global supply chains. But that morning, he wasn't a boss. He was just a man in a sharply tailored suit, a target for the kind of casual prejudice that thrived in spaces like this. The air inside the VIP cabin was chilled, but not as cold as the stairs that followed him when he first took his seat. Rows of luxury seats became invisible cages, where judgment was passed more swiftly than champagne. The woman in the beige coat had paused mid-aisle, her eyes sweeping over him, lingering just long enough to signal that something was wrong with the picture, that he was wrong. She had whispered something to the flight attendant, and a moment later, the attendant was standing over him with that forced, plastic smile, the one designed to de-escalate, but really just patronized. "Sir, there's been a mix-up," she repeated, her tone hardening slightly when he didn't immediately comply. Rico's expression was unreadable. He looked from her face to the woman, then back again. "A mix-up?" he asked, his voice even, almost curious. "My ticket confirms this seat. 1A. He didn't raise it to show her. He didn't need to. He knew his rights, and she knew he knew. This wasn't about a ticket. This was about something else entirely. Phones were already out, recording discreetly. Passengers pretended to read their magazines, but their eyes were locked on the drama unfolding in the most expensive row on the plane. The attendant's smile finally vanished, replaced by a tight, angry line. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper meant only for him. "It's standard protocol. That passenger has priority." Before Rico could even respond, she turned away from him, her eyes locking onto a figure standing near the galley. A man in a senior cabin manager's uniform took a deliberate step forward, his face a mask of authority. It was clear this was no longer a request. It was an ultimatum. The man who approached wore his authority like his uniform, crisp, starched, and designed to command respect without earning it. He was the senior cabin manager, and his smile was a corporate weapon, perfectly pleasant and utterly devoid of warmth. He didn't look at Rico first. Instead, his eyes went to the flight attendant, a quick, affirming nod that said, "I'm with you." Then he glanced at the white woman, a silent apology that promised a swift resolution. Only then did his gaze finally fall on Rico Anderson, not as a person, but as a problem, as a disruption to the schedule. "Sir," the manager began, his voice smooth and practiced, the kind of voice he used to placate angry customers without ever admitting fault. "It seems we have a slight operational issue with the seating manifest." He used the word operational like a shield, a piece of corporate jargon meant to end the conversation before it began. It wasn't a mistake. It was an issue. It wasn't about people. It was about operations. Rico's calm never wavered. He met the manager's gaze, his own eyes like polished stones. "There is no issue," he stated, his voice low but carrying through the silent cabin. "I am in my assigned seat, which was confirmed this morning." The manager's smile tightened just a fraction. This wasn't the quick, embarrassed compliance he was used to. He held up a placating hand, speaking slowly now, as if explaining a complex idea to a child. I understand your frustration, I really do. But sometimes, in a dynamic environment like this, we have to rely on the professional discretion of our experienced crew to resolve these things efficiently. It's simply an operational necessity. There was again, the system speaking through him. The flight attendant's facade of politeness had now been replaced by a smug, vindicated look. She stood just behind her manager, her arms crossed, her position now backed by the full weight of the airline's authority. This was no longer about one employee's prejudice. This was policy. This was procedure. This was a man in a uniform telling another man that his ticket, his status, and his rights were worth less than their discretion. Have you ever been in a situation where the facts don't matter? Where the people in charge have already decided you're in the wrong before you've even had a chance to speak? That's the moment the system fails. Or rather, the moment you realize the system was never designed to protect you in the first place. Rico saw it clearly now. He wasn't a passenger. He was an obstacle. The manager wasn't a mediator. He was an enforcer. And the woman in pearls was already mentally redecorating her new seat. The manager leaned in, his voice dropping but losing none of its condescending edge. Look, we don't want any more trouble. My flight attendant has made a judgment call based on her experience, and I'm backing her play. This is a full flight, and we need to get airborne. He looked Rico up and down one last time, a final dismissive appraisal. The decision has been made. It's time to comply. But what the manager didn't see, what the smug flight attendant and the entitled passenger couldn't possibly know, was that their biggest mistake wasn't the injustice. It was the witness. Because 6 rows back, a young man had just lifted his phone, his thumb hovering over the record button, about to document the exact moment a corporate policy became a public crime. While the drama unfolded in the rarefied air of first class, most other passengers just stared, frozen in that unique public paralysis that happens when something is deeply wrong, but no one wants to be the first to speak up. They were witnesses, but silent ones. All except for one. In seat 12B, a young tech intern named Leo felt a hot surge of anger. He'd seen this movie before. He knew how the official report would read. A disruptive passenger was politely reseated due to a ticketing error. The truth would be buried under a mountain of corporate doublespeak. He saw the smugness on the flight attendant's face and the cold authority of the manager. But most of all, he saw the unshakable dignity of the black man in the sharp suit. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't pleading. He was simply standing his ground, and for that, he was being treated like a criminal. Leo's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his phone. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a simple, modern act of defiance. He angled it just right, shielding the screen with his hand, and pressed the small, red circle. The recording began. He became the audience's eyes and ears. His phone captured the undeniable truth. The manager's condescending tone, the flight attendant's dismissive posture, and Rico's calm, steady refusal to be erased. While others saw a problem, Leo's camera saw a man being systematically humiliated for the crime of existing in a space where he supposedly didn't belong. The footage wasn't shaky or panicked. It was focused. It was evidence. Let's be honest for a second. In that same situation, what would you have done? Would you have hit record, knowing you might be next? Or would you have sunk lower in your seat, praying no one made eye contact? Leo made his choice. Through his small screen, he watched the manager's face twist, his professional mask crumbling under the weight of Rico's quiet resistance. The corporate smile was gone. The calm, condescending tone evaporated. It was replaced by something raw and ugly. Leo zoomed in just as the manager, his patience completely gone, leaned forward, his voice no longer a suggestion, but a threat that echoed through the entire cabin. The cabin manager's voice boomed into the suffocating silence. Each word a carefully chosen brick in the wall being built around Rico Anderson. Sir, if you don't move to your assigned economy seat now, I'll have to call airport security and have you removed from the flight for noncompliance. The threat wasn't just spoken, it was deployed. It hung in the air, thick and ugly, an act of ultimate authority. This was the final move in their game, the checkmate. They were threatening a 62-year-old man in a tailored suit with arrest for the crime of sitting in a seat he had paid for. The injustice of it was so raw, so absolute, that a few passengers audibly gasped. This was the peak of his powerlessness. In this metal tube, sealed off from the world and governed by its own set of rules, his lifetime of achievement meant nothing. His character, his dignity, his status, it was all irrelevant. He was just a black man who was being told he was in the wrong place, and a man with a uniform held all the power. The system was no longer just failing him. It was actively trying to crush him. Through the lens of Leo's phone, the scene was crystal clear, a public takedown sanctioned by corporate authority. As if on cue, the white woman in pearls saw her opening. She didn't wait for a resolution. With a smirk playing on her lips, a look of pure, unadulterated victory, she slid past Rico and settled into seat 1A. She adjusted her coat, sank into the plush leather, and looked forward as if he was no longer there. It was a throne she had rightfully claimed. The humiliation was now complete, a spectacle for everyone to witness. The audience's outrage, their feeling of helpless anger, was at its absolute peak. What would you do in that moment? Would you scream? Would you fight? Would you let the rage consume you and prove them right? Rico Anderson did none of those things. The steady rhythm of his own heartbeat was the only sound in his ears. He looked at the manager, the flight attendant, and the woman in his seat. And then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a nod of defeat. It was a nod of acceptance. Okay, it seemed to say, this is how we're playing it. He turned and began the long walk of shame down the aisle. Every eye was on him. He passed the rows of luxury seats, the space and comfort of first class shrinking behind him. He crossed the threshold into economy, where the aisle narrowed and the air felt thicker. But just as he was about to disappear into the back of the plane, he stopped. He didn't turn around completely. He just paused, his back still to the first-class cabin, and stood there for a single, silent beat. The manager opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, Rico did something that wasn't on their script, something that hinted this was far from over. Rico stood at the edge of first class, a man displaced. The cabin manager, sensing victory, opened his mouth to deliver a final, dismissive command. But the words never came, because Rico Anderson turned, not with the slumped shoulders of a defeated man, but with the focused precision of a surgeon. He didn't look angry. He looked interested. His eyes, calm and piercing, bypassed the flight attendant and locked directly onto the manager. The entire cabin, still holding its collective breath, leaned in. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air with the unnerving clarity of a legal deposition. I trust you are all familiar with your own contract of carriage, he said, his tone perfectly even. Section 12, subsection B, regarding involuntary downgrades. The manager's face went blank. The flight attendant froze, her smug expression dissolving into confusion and then dawning horror. A regular passenger doesn't know the contract of carriage. They don't quote subsections. That is the language of lawyers, of executives, of people who own the game, not just play in it. It was a tiny crack in their armor of authority, but it was deep. In that single sentence, Rico had completely reframed the encounter. He wasn't a victim of the rules. He was a master of them. A cold, terrible silence descended on the crew. They had been expecting anger, pleading, maybe even a lawsuit later. They were prepared for emotion. They were not prepared for this cold, strategic, and deeply knowledgeable response. Who was this man? The question hung in the air between them, a silent, panicked alarm. Their biggest mistake wasn't just prejudice. It was a catastrophic underestimation. Rico let the weight of his words settle for a moment, watching the panic flicker in their eyes. Then he delivered the final, chilling line. I will comply, he said, pausing just long enough to let them think they'd won before adding, for now, without waiting for a response. He turned his back on them and walked calmly into the economy cabin, leaving a crater of shock and confusion behind him. His quiet compliance was no longer an act of surrender. It was a declaration of war. The manager stood paralyzed, the condescending words dead on his lips. A cold dread washed over him. He had followed protocol. He had backed his team. and he had the sickening feeling he had just made a career-ending mistake. He had no idea that 6 rows back, a video of the entire exchange was already being queued for upload, a digital fuse that was about to be lit. As Flight 217 leveled off at its cruising altitude, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. In the back, Rico Anderson was an island of stillness in the cramped sea of economy. He sat in seat 28B, a middle seat, a position so fundamentally uncomfortable it felt like a deliberate insult. The fabric of the seat was thin and worn, a world away from the plush leather he had occupied an hour ago. His knees were pressed against the seat in front of him, a man accustomed to boardrooms, now confined to a space that felt smaller than his own office chair. He wasn't scrolling on his phone or stewing in rage. He simply stared out the small, scratched window at the endless blue, his mind a quiet whirlwind of calculations. Not about the billion-dollar merger on his tablet, but about the incalculable cost of prejudice. He was waiting. He knew that in the modern world, one person's truth is just a story, but a documented injustice is a weapon. 6 rows ahead, in seat 12B, Leo the intern felt the weight of that weapon in his hand. The moment the plane's sluggish Wi-Fi signal flickered to life, his heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. The progress bar for the video upload crawled across his screen, each percentage point a lifetime. He felt a flash of fear. What if the crew saw him? What if he got in trouble? But then he remembered the look on Rico's face, not of anger, but of profound disappointment. He wasn't an activist. He was just a kid with a conscience and a Wi-Fi connection. And in that moment, that was enough. He typed the caption, his thumbs flying, each word a small rebellion. This is what hashtag Flying While Black looks like on this airline. He tagged the company's official handle, a direct challenge. He took one last, shaky breath and hit post. The effect wasn't a spark. It was a digital supernova. The first shares were from people who felt a familiar sting of recognition. But then it was picked up by a civil rights activist with 2 million followers. An A-list actress in Hollywood saw it and tweeted, "This is disgusting. Name and shame them." The video, a perfect, infuriating loop of corporate arrogance and quiet dignity, began to multiply, to replicate, to flood every corner of the internet. The comment sections became a torrent of pure, unfiltered rage. That manager needs to be fired before they land. I'm canceling my flight with them right now. My heart breaks for that man. Look at the grace he showed them. The hashtag Flying While Black became a global rallying cry. And then the internet's digital detectives got to work. In a Reddit thread, someone ran a facial recognition scan. On Twitter, a user who worked in fashion recognized the impeccable cut of Rico's suit. The pieces began to connect in a frenzy of crowdsourced investigation. Finally, a business journalist put it all together in a single, explosive tweet. This isn't just a passenger. That's Rico Anderson, the CEO of Anderson Logistics, a Fortune 500 company. The airline didn't just disrespect a customer. They humiliated a titan. That single tweet added rocket fuel to a wildfire. The story was no longer just about racism. It was about a catastrophic corporate failure. The headlines on news sites changed in real time. Man mistreated on flight became Fortune 500 CEO humiliated by airline crew. The irony was too rich, too staggering to ignore. By the time the plane was over Alabama, the airline's brand was in an uncontrolled, multi-million-dollar freefall. And in their gleaming, sterile headquarters hundreds of miles away, a junior analyst named Ben watched his social media dashboard light up with so much red it looked like the building was on fire. The negative sentiment metric had broken the algorithm. His boss was screaming about getting it under control, but Ben knew this was like trying to bottle a tsunami. His blood ran cold. He typed Rico Anderson's name into their corporate client database, praying he'd find nothing. But there it was. Not just a client, a keystone client. He saw the multi-million-dollar cargo contract personally signed by Rico. Ben felt the floor drop out from under him. He grabbed the printout and sprinted toward the senior vice president's office, knowing he was about to deliver news that would make a viral video seem like a mild inconvenience. The corporate headquarters of the airline was a glass and steel monument to order and control. But inside the C-suite, there was only chaos. Executives shouted into phones as the stock ticker on a massive wall-mounted screen bled red. The public relations team was in a full-blown meltdown, their pre-written, soulless apologies about reviewing the incident being torn to shreds by millions of furious comments online. They had lost control of the narrative. They had lost control of everything. Then, the door to the CEO's emergency meeting burst open. It was Ben, the junior analyst, his face pale and slick with sweat, clutching a single piece of paper like it was a grenade. Every argument stopped. Every head turned. He stumbled forward and slapped the paper down on the polished mahogany table. "Sir," he stammered, pointing a trembling finger. "Rico Anderson. He's not just a passenger." The CEO snatched the sheet. His eyes scanned the page, his expression shifting from anger to confusion, and then to sheer, bottomless horror. It wasn't just a corporate account. It was Anderson Logistics, one of their largest, most vital cargo clients. A contract worth tens of millions of dollars a year. A contract he had personally negotiated. A contract signed by Rico Anderson himself. In an instant, the viral video was no longer a PR crisis. It was a 5-alarm corporate fire threatening to burn the entire company to the ground. Have you ever seen that moment when pure arrogance collapses into pure terror? The CEO's hands fumbled as he grabbed his personal cell phone, his fingers stabbing at the screen to dial Rico's private number. The entire room held its breath as the phone went to speaker, the hollow electronic ring echoing in the tomb-like silence. Once, twice. On the third ring, it clicked. But it wasn't Rico's voice. It was the cold, digital finality of his voicemail. As the airline CEO's desperate, frantic call went to voicemail, a world away and miles in the air, Rico Anderson felt his phone vibrate against his leg. He pulled it from his pocket. The name flashed on the screen, stark and bright in the dim cabin light. Robert Henderson, CEO. For a single, fleeting moment, Rico considered answering, considered listening to the panicked apologies and desperate promises he knew were waiting. Then, with the cold, deliberate precision of a man signing off on a multi-billion-dollar deal, he pressed his thumb to the screen and silenced the call. Too late for that, Robert. Around him, the passengers of economy class were oblivious, lost in their movies and magazines, unaware that a corporate war had just been declared from the cramped confines of Seat 28B. He didn't waste a second. He bypassed the public Wi-Fi, initiating a secure, encrypted call through a private satellite link. The screen read, "Initiating emergency board meeting." Within seconds, the voices of his most trusted executives filled the line, a chorus of confusion. "Rico, is everything all right? We weren't expecting to hear from you." It was Alistair, his COO, his voice sharp with concern. Rico's voice, when he spoke, was a blade of ice. He didn't shout. He didn't complain. He laid out the facts like a prosecutor presenting an open and shut case. On Flight 217, I was involuntarily downgraded from a confirmed, paid first-class seat. The situation was handled by the cabin crew and a senior manager with extreme prejudice and a complete disregard for the contract of carriage. A heavy, stunned silence hung on the line, the sound of powerful people processing a massive, unexpected shock. They knew him. He never dealt in emotion, only in consequences. Then, he delivered the kill shot. "Effective immediately," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for debate. "You are to terminate every logistics deal with this airline. Every single contract, every partnership. Ground any of our cargo currently in their fleet. Reroute everything. I don't care about the cost. I want our names scrubbed from their manifests by morning." "It's done." Stunned silence again, this time followed by a wave of quiet, firm affirmations. "Yes, sir. Understood. It's already in motion." He had just incinerated an $85 million partnership, and not a single person on his board dared to ask why. They didn't need to. As Rico disconnected the call, the roar of the engines filling the silence, his mind wasn't on the financial explosion he had just triggered. It drifted back. A bland convention center ballroom from a year ago. The smell of stale hotel coffee and ambition. the forced smiles of networking executives. He remembered the airline's CEO, Robert Henderson, fawning over him, laughing a little too loudly at his jokes. The ink was still drying on the massive contract between them. "Rico, a pleasure as always," Henderson had said, grabbing his arm. "Before you go, I want you to meet Amelia Vance, our new SVP of Operations. She's a real shark, an absolute killer." And there she was, the woman from seat 1A. A beige coat, a string of pearls, and a handshake that was firm but cold. He remembered the flicker in her eyes as she sized him up, not with respect, but with the detached calculation of a rival. He had recognized it instantly. It was the look of someone who believed her title was a crown, not a responsibility. The memory dissolved, bringing him back to the present. His quiet calm wasn't shock. His compliance wasn't weakness. The moment Amelia Vance had stopped in the aisle and glared at him, he knew exactly who she was. He knew arguing with a senior executive on her own turf was a losing battle. But he also knew something she didn't. An argument can be dismissed. A shouting match can be spun. But a calm, dignified black CEO being publicly humiliated by a powerful white executive, all captured on high-definition video, that was a weapon of mass destruction. He didn't need to raise his voice. He just needed to give her enough rope. The "fasten seatbelt" sign chimed through the cabin. He looked out the window as the plane began its descent, the lights of Atlanta glittering below. Amelia Vance, in seat 1A, was probably sipping her champagne, celebrating her small, petty victory. She had no idea the man in 28B had already signed her professional death warrant. She had no idea the plane wasn't just landing in Atlanta. It was landing in the middle of her own personal reckoning, and the wheels were touching down. The jolt of the plane touching down in Atlanta was a punctuation mark. For most passengers, it was the end of a journey. For Amelia Vance in seat 1A, it was the beginning of the end. As the plane taxied to the gate, she finally switched her phone off airplane mode, a self-satisfied smile on her face. Then, the screen lit up and her world collapsed. A tidal wave of notifications, dozens of missed calls from her CEO, a flood of frantic texts from her team, and news alerts blinking with headlines that made her blood run cold. Hashtag flying while black trends worldwide. Anderson Logistics terminates multi-million-dollar contract. Her smile vanished, replaced by a mask of horrified disbelief. She saw the stock price. She saw the video. She saw her own face, her own smug entitlement, playing on a loop for the entire world. The news of the canceled contracts had already hit the financial wires. The firestorm wasn't coming. It was already here. When the cabin door opened, a grim-faced man in a suit was waiting on the jet bridge. He wasn't her driver. "Amelia," he said, his voice stripped of all warmth. "The CEO sent me. You're needed at headquarters." Now, it wasn't a request. Back in the boardroom, the airline's board of directors was in an uproar. Firing the flight attendant and the manager was no longer enough. This was a catastrophic crisis of leadership, and it had a face. The viral video, the public fury, and the colossal financial loss. It all pointed to the woman who had just landed. Is it fair for one person to take the fall for a whole system's failure? Or did she, as a leader, have a greater responsibility to be better? Amelia walked into the silent boardroom. Every eye was on her, not with respect, but with the cold fury of judges about to pass sentence. The CEO didn't even stand up. He just slid a tablet across the vast, polished table. On the screen was the viral video, paused on the exact moment she slid into seat 1A with that triumphant smirk. "Amelia," the CEO's voice was quiet, deadly. "Explain this." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. There was nothing to say. Her career was over. But as the door to that boardroom clicked shut, sealing her fate, another meeting was being requested across town. One between the humbled CEO of a disgraced airline and Rico Anderson, who was about to prove that he wasn't interested in a simple apology. He was interested in surrender. A few days later, in a sterile, high-stakes boardroom that smelled of fear and expensive coffee, the leadership of the disgraced airline waited. Their stock had taken a brutal beating, and their brand was now synonymous with corporate racism. Their CEO, Robert Henderson, sat at the head of the table, flanked by a team of stone-faced lawyers. They had spent the last 48 hours preparing for this meeting, gaming out scenarios, and calculating settlement figures. They were ready for a fight. They expected demands for millions, a lawsuit that would drag on for years, a negotiation over damages. They came to the table prepared to lose money. They were not prepared for what Rico Anderson wanted instead. When Rico entered with his own legal team, the power dynamic in the room was absolute. He was calm, composed, and moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who had already won. Henderson's team, by contrast, was a collection of frayed nerves and anxious glances. Henderson began with a rehearsed, groveling apology. Rico, on behalf of our entire organization, I want to express our deepest, most sincere regrets for the unfortunate incident on Flight 217. It was a catastrophic failure of our standards. He then pivoted to the real reason he thought they were there. We are, of course, prepared to discuss the terms of a generous financial compensation to... I'm not here for your money, Robert. Rico's voice was quiet, but it cut through the CEO's speech like a razor, silencing the entire room. He let the statement hang in the air, watching the confusion ripple across the faces of the airline's executives. They looked at each other, completely thrown off balance. If not money, then what? Rico leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with Henderson's. You see, a settlement allows you to write a check and pretend this never happened. It lets you file this away as the cost of doing business. I'm not interested in that. He gestured to his lawyer, who placed a single, thin folder on the table. I'm interested in reform. My terms are not financial. They are structural. He laid them out one by one, each demand a direct command. First, you will scrap your current diversity and inclusion program effective immediately. It is a proven failure. My team will provide a list of 3 independent firms. You will hire one to build a new, mandatory training protocol from the ground up. He paused, letting the orders sink in before continuing. Second, you will fund a comprehensive, third-party audit of all passenger complaints from the last 5 years to identify patterns of racial bias. The full, unedited findings of that audit will be made public. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. And third, you will work with my counsel to draft a new passenger bill of rights. It will be a permanent part of your contract of carriage, a constant reminder to every customer of why this meeting was necessary. Henderson stared across the table, his mind reeling. This was so much worse than a lawsuit. This was a public surrender, a complete dismantling of their corporate culture, dictated by the very man they had humiliated. It was unprecedented. It was unthinkable. And looking at the stock reports on his tablet, he knew it was also his only way out. You're asking for a public crucifixion, Henderson whispered, his voice hoarse. Rico's face remained unreadable. No, he replied, his voice dangerously soft. I'm offering you a path to redemption. The only question is whether you're smart enough to take it. In the days following the boardroom surrender, the consequences began to unfold, not with the quiet finality of a memo, but with the public brutality of an execution. The airline, now a puppet with Rico Anderson pulling the strings, began its agonizing transformation in the full glare of the world spotlight. For the millions who had watched the video, what came next was a masterclass in accountability, a slow, deliberate, and deeply satisfying dismantling of the system that had failed so spectacularly. It started with a single act of rebellion from within. A junior HR employee, haunted by the quiet dignity of the man in the video, sat at their desk long after hours. With trembling hands, they attached a file to an encrypted email addressed to a well-known journalist. It was a risk that could end their career, but the alternative, silence, felt like a betrayal. The file was the internal memo announcing the termination of the flight attendant and senior cabin manager from Flight 217. Within an hour, it was verified. Within 2, it was a headline. The first domino had not just fallen. It had been pushed over for the world to see. The internet's reaction was immediate, a wave of grim satisfaction, followed by a singular, unified demand. Good. Read a top comment with 1 million likes. That's the help. Now get the boss. They didn't have to wait long. Inside her sprawling corner office, Amelia Vance was in denial. She was a senior vice president. She was protected. She was frantically drafting a counter-narrative, a statement that would paint the cabin crew as rogue employees who had acted against protocol. Then, the private line on her desk buzzed. It was the chairman of the board. The conversation was brutally short. "Amelia," he said, his voice like ice, "your resignation is expected on my desk within the hour. Do not make this difficult." The line went dead. Her fall from grace was swift and savage. The airline's official press release was a work of art in corporate destruction, citing a staggering lack of judgment and a catastrophic failure of leadership. The next day, as she tried to slip out a side entrance of the corporate headquarters, the press was waiting. The machine gun fire of clicking shutters was deafening. One flash caught her face at the perfect angle, capturing not the powerful executive she had been yesterday, but a woman hollowed out by the consequences of her own arrogance. The image of her clutching a cardboard box, her eyes wide with a flicker of pure terror, became the defining photo of the scandal. But the final act of surrender was reserved for the CEO himself. Robert Henderson's PR team had prepped him for hours, but nothing could prepare him for the sheer weight of the moment. Just before he walked on stage for the press conference, his communications chief gave him one last piece of advice. "No excuses, Robert. No jargon. Just complete and total surrender." He looked broken, diminished, a ghost in a $1,000 suit. His apology was a public confession. "I want to apologize personally and unreservedly to Mr. Rico Anderson," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Our system failed him. Our culture failed him. And I, as CEO, failed him." As he spoke, you could see the real-time effect. On the financial news tickers, the airline stock, which had been in freefall, began to stabilize. The market wasn't rewarding his excuses. It was rewarding his unconditional surrender. It was a total, undeniable victory. In a coffee shop in Silicon Valley, Leo, the intern, watched on his laptop and allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. In an airport lounge in Chicago, a veteran black pilot watched the CEO's groveling apology and nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. The story should have ended there. But in a boardroom 1,000 miles away, the CEO of another major corporation pointed to a picture of Rico Anderson on a large screen. "Let's be clear," he said to his silent executive team. "The rules just changed. I want our de-escalation and bias protocols reviewed by the end of the week. I will not have a Flight 217 happen to us." The reckoning wasn't just for one airline anymore. Rico's quiet stand had just put all of corporate America on notice. The headlines faded, as they always do. The airline stock began its slow, painful recovery under the weight of its new, mandated reforms. But the story of Flight 217 didn't disappear. It evolved. It moved from the breaking news cycle into the very culture itself, becoming a modern parable about power, prejudice, and the price of disrespect in the 21st century. In a lecture hall at a prestigious business school, a professor clicked to a new slide. On one side was Rico Anderson's face. On the other, the airline stock chart showing a near-vertical drop. "Forget the PR crisis," the professor told his MBA students, his voice echoing in the tiered room. "That's brand management 101. This was a catastrophic failure of partner risk assessment. They did not conduct proper due diligence on the man who controlled one of their most vital supply chain contracts." The lesson? The biggest risk to your company isn't always on the balance sheet. Sometimes it's sitting quietly in seat 1A, and you've mistaken him for a problem. On a heated cable news panel, a civil rights activist used the story as a new blueprint for the movement. "For decades, we've made moral appeals," she argued passionately. Rico Anderson provided a new model, strategic economic action. He didn't just ask for change. He made prejudice too expensive for the system to afford. The pundit across from her scoffed. "But isn't that a dangerous precedent? What about the average person who doesn't have an $80 million contract to cancel?" The activist smiled. He created a playbook. He showed that every corporation has a vulnerability. His was economic. The next person's might be different. He taught us to find the leverage. And at a quiet family dinner table, A black father looked at his teenage son, who was about to head off to college. "So I'm just supposed to take it?" the son asked, his voice filled with frustration. "Let people disrespect me?" His father shook his head. "No, son. You don't take it. You absorb it. You stay in control. Anger is what they expect. You're calm. Your intelligence, that's the weapon they never see coming." Rico Anderson didn't win because he was angry. He won because he was smarter. The world had turned Rico Anderson into a legend. His silent walk was a masterclass in turning humiliation into leverage. But legends don't have to deal with the messy aftermath. One morning, a single, hand-addressed envelope arrived at his private office. It had no corporate logo. It was from Amelia Vance. And it wasn't a threat. It was an apology. The letter sat on his desk for a full day before he touched it. The simple, hand-addressed envelope from Amelia Vance felt heavier than any corporate prospectus. It was an object he never expected to exist. A surrender sent from the ruins of a career he had personally demolished. When he finally slid it open, the words inside were not what he expected. There were no excuses, no justifications, no attempts to shift the blame. It was a raw, broken apology. She wrote of the sickness of entitlement she had harbored for years, of the public shame that had forced her to confront the person she had become. "I'm not writing to ask for your forgiveness, which I know I have not earned," the letter concluded. "I am writing simply to acknowledge the truth of my actions and the profound harm they caused." He called in his COO and his chief legal counsel. He let them read the letter. Their advice was immediate and unanimous. "It's a trap, Rico," his lawyer said bluntly. "She's laying the groundwork for a wrongful termination suit. Any response you make will be used against you. Shred it." His COO agreed. She got what she deserved. There is nothing to be gained by engaging. It was sound, logical advice. The corporate playbook would be to ignore her, to protect himself from any further risk. But Rico saw something else. He didn't see an antagonist trying to set a trap. He saw a person who was the perfect product of a flawed system, a system that had rewarded her arrogance right up until the moment it consumed her. Punishing her had been necessary. But what if her ruin could be used to build something better? Rico looked at his two most trusted advisors. "You're both wrong," he said quietly. "She's not a legal liability. She's an asset." They stared back, confused. Rico picked up his desk phone and buzzed his assistant. "Find me a neutral location," he commanded, his voice firm with a decision already made. "I'm going to meet with her." Weeks later, Rico Anderson stood before a packed auditorium, the heat of the television lights warm on his face. The air crackled with anticipation. In the front rows, civil rights leaders sat beside journalists, while in the back, anxious executives from every major airline were present. Not out of support, but out of fear. Rico looked out at the sea of faces, a mix of allies, enemies, and opportunists, and felt the familiar calm settle over him. He was no longer just a CEO. He was a cultural force, and he was about to make his next move. He took the stage to a thunderous, standing ovation, a wave of sound that he acknowledged with a simple, dignified nod. When the room finally fell silent, he began. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady and clear, filling the vast space. What happened on Flight 217 was not about one man or one seat. It was a symptom of a systemic illness, a culture of exclusion that hides in plain sight. An apology is a start. Firing people is a consequence, but neither is a cure. He paused, letting his words sink in. The airline responsible for that incident has provided a substantial financial settlement, but a check does not buy back dignity. It does not erase a culture of neglect. So, we are taking that money, and we're going to use it to build what they failed to. He announced the formation of the Anderson Aviation Initiative, a foundation dedicated to providing scholarships, mentorships, and executive placement for a new, diverse generation of black pilots, engineers, and leaders. The room erupted in applause again. This was the move of a statesman. It was inspiring, powerful, and exactly what they expected. But as the applause began to fade, Rico held up a hand for silence. The room grew quiet again, but this time, the quiet was tense, uncertain. "Changing the future," he said, his voice dropping. requires us to honestly and painfully confront the past. And to do that, I need to introduce someone. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. Journalists exchanged frantic looks. His own team in the wings looked at each other in panic. What is he doing? There is a woman who, through her actions, became the public face of this problem. Her career is over. Her reputation is ruined. And most would say she got exactly what she deserved. He let that hang in the air. But what if her story could be more than just a cautionary tale? What if her painful public failure could become our most powerful tool for change? He looked toward the side of the stage. Please welcome Amelia Vance. It was a detonation. A cacophony of shocked gasps, shouted questions, and a frantic whirring of cameras filled the auditorium. From the wings, Amelia Vance emerged. She was not the powerful SVP from the airplane. Dressed in a simple gray suit, she looked smaller, broken. She walked stiffly toward the podium, her eyes fixed on the floor, flinching with every camera flash. It was the longest walk of her life, each step a universe of shame, taken in front of 1,000 hostile witnesses. She reached the podium, her hands trembling. Rico stood beside her, a silent, powerful gesture that confused and enraged many in the crowd. He spoke again. Accountability is not just about punishment. It's about making amends. It's about using the painful truth of what you've done to ensure it never happens again. He then turned to the trembling woman beside him. Amelia, my foundation is offering you a role. This is not a job. It is not a title. It is a chance. We want you to work with us, to tell your story, the real story, of how a culture of privilege and entitlement led you to the worst mistake of your life. This is not an easy path, but it is the only path I see toward any kind of meaningful redemption. His offer hung in the silent, stunned auditorium. It was an act of breathtaking grace and a power move of unimaginable audacity. Every camera, every eye, was now on Amelia Vance. She looked up, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She gripped the sides of the podium, her knuckles white. She took a shaky breath, leaned into the microphones, and opened her mouth to speak. In the silent, stunned auditorium, all eyes were on Amelia Vance. She looked at the sea of hostile faces, then at the man beside her who was offering her this impossible choice: disappear into shame or embrace it as a tool for the rest of her life. She took a shaky breath, leaned into the microphone, and with a voice that was barely a whisper but heard by the entire world, she said, yes. That yes was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the real work. 1 year later, the world looked different. The furious headlines about Flight 217 had long since faded, but the changes Rico Anderson had forced into motion were quiet, permanent, and spreading. At the airline he had brought to its knees, the new Anderson standard was in full effect. In a training simulator, a new class of flight attendants was running a scenario. For years, the instructor told them, the manual taught you to see a conflict as an operational necessity to be resolved. Your job now is to see the human being first. Always. Failure to do so isn't just a customer service issue. It's a career-ending event. Amelia Vance, no longer an executive, traveled the country. Her talks were not polished corporate speeches, but raw, painful confessions. At one university, a young student asked her, "But didn't you just make a mistake? Couldn't that happen to anyone?" Amelia's answer was brutally honest. "It wasn't a mistake," she said, her voice steady. "It was a choice born from 1,000 unexamined privileges. The real mistake was believing that my title made me immune to consequences." She was not redeemed, not fully. Redemption is a long, hard road, but she was for the first time walking it. Rico's reforms became the industry gold standard as other airlines, terrified of their own Flight 217 moment, rushed to adopt similar policies. The real victory was never about the canceled contract. That was just the leverage. It was never about the firings. That was just accountability. The real victory was quieter. One afternoon, at that same Atlanta airport, Rico Anderson was walking to his gate, just another traveler in the crowd. He saw a young black pilot standing at the entrance to a cockpit, greeting passengers. The pilot was a graduate of the Anderson Initiative's first scholarship class. As a family boarded, a little black girl, no older than 7, stopped and stared up at the pilot, her eyes wide with a wonder she had never known was possible. The pilot saw her, and his professional smile softened into something warmer. He gave her a slow, deliberate wink. Rico stopped, watching from a distance, a small, private smile on his own face. He saw it all in that one tiny moment, the closing of a circle and the beginning of a new one. That is his true legacy. Not the revenge he took, but the future he built. Not a contract he canceled, but a culture he changed. A door kicked open for the next generation. It's a powerful story of how one man can force a system to bend to his will. But it leaves us with one final, haunting question. Why did a man have to be a CEO with an $80 million contract just to be treated like a human being? Before you go, please do 3 like this video, share it, and subscribe. The story of Flight 217 was heard because one person hit record and because millions of you refused to let it be ignored. For every Rico Anderson, there are thousands of other stories that happen in the dark with no cameras and no one to bear witness. When you like this video, you tell the world that these stories matter. When you share it, you make sure the truth is heard, even when others want it silenced. And when you subscribe, you become more than just a viewer. You become a witness, ensuring that the next time a voice is pushed into the shadows, you are here to help us drag it back into the light. Don't let the next story disappear. Subscribe.